From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm the head of the Near East section here in the African Middle Eastern Division. On behalf of all the staff, and in particular our chief, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, I wish you all the warmest of welcomes. Unfortunately, Dr. Deeb can't be with us this afternoon, and in a minute when I'm done, I have to run off to the same meeting that Dr. Deeb is attending. As I said, I'm the head of the Near East section. The Near East section is one of three sections of the African Middle Eastern Division. The other two sections are the African section, whose staff are responsible for developing the collection from and about sub-Saharan Africa and providing reference and access to the collections. The Hebraic section concerns itself with Hebrew and Judaica worldwide, and its staff is, of course, responsible for the development of that collection and for providing access to that collection. Then there is the Near East section, of which I'm head. The Near East section covers, in its responsibilities, all of the Arab countries, Turkey and Turkic Central Asia, the countries of the Caucasus, Iran and Afghanistan, as well as the Muslims in Western China, Russia, and the Balkans. Or in a more succinct way, our area of responsibility runs from Casablanca in the west to Kashgar in the east, from Khartoum in the south to Kazan in the north. And as with the other two sections, the staff of the Near East section is responsible for developing the collection from and about the countries in each of their areas of responsibility, and for assisting readers and helping with access to the collections. Now, the Near East section itself is custodial, and by that means we hold materials here, and in particular, we hold materials in the local language collections. So of a total collection of about 480,000 volumes, about half are in Arabic. There are 75 to 80,000 each in Persian and Turkish, Ottoman Turkish. And then there are some 36 other languages. Probably of those, the most numerous number of volumes are in Armenian, the collection of which is now bumping up against 40,000 volumes. And as I said, the staff provides access to the collections. And part of that creating of access is also outreach. And these noontime lectures that we hold are part of the outreach, in which members of the staff discover, importune, otherwise get individuals, often who have worked in our reading room doing research, to present about their research and about their books. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Muhammad Salhi, one of the Arab world specialists, to come up and speak about today's speaker. But today's lecture, like so many others, is another way of giving the public access, to the collections and to what we do here. So without further ado, I'd ask Muhammad to come forward.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Our speaker today, Amy Riolo, is an internationally recognized expert known for fusing the worlds of cuisine, culture, and history in her work. An award-winning author, popular lecturer, cooking show host, food writer, culinary consultant, and cooking instructor, she was dubbed Cook to the Kings by a Cairo newspaper in 2008. Her books include Arabian Delights, Recipes, and Princely Entertaining Ideas from the Arabian Peninsula. 16 volumes worth staining, as it was dubbed by the Washington Post. Nile Style, Egyptian Cuisine and Culture, which was given the World Gourmand Award the World Gourmand Award for Best Arab Cuisine Book in the United States. She also has the Mediterranean Diabetes Cookbook, which received the 2011 Nautilus Book Award. A note to the audience, this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. Also, I would like to mention that there's going to be a book signing after the event, and I'm sure our speaker would be happy to sign the books for you. Without further ado, Amy Riolo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed, for that really warm introduction, and thank you to Mr. Murphy, who couldn't be with us today. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. Some of you I've seen a few years ago, and some of you are new. I really appreciate you coming and spending a portion of your afternoon with me and allowing me to speak about one of my favorite topics. In 1996, I picked up a Lonely Planet travel guide about Egypt, and they said that Egypt has many wonderful things to offer, but that cuisine is not one of them. So I said, great, I'm going there, and what am I gonna eat? You know, I want to eat well, life is short, I think that everybody should eat well. So that started my quest to discover what Egyptian cuisine really was. And of course, when I went there, I found that it was wonderful. But more than that, I found that there were ties between the anthropology that's involved in cuisine and the history, and that with the Mediterranean and the world at large. So that became one of my missions, is to study and record these things, and many of them are located in the book, and we're gonna talk about them today. So what I hope out of today's lecture is that we'll be able to define Egyptian cuisine and discuss how it's unique. I also would like for everybody to experience a little bit about the history and the culture. And we're going to discuss some exciting new discoveries, what are called cultural periods of understanding Egyptian history. These are the periods in ancient Egyptian history as they're defined today. On the left, we have the current method, and that's the way that they've been pretty much for the last year since Napoleon. They've really been divided into these types of categories, starting with the early dynastic period in 3150 before the Common Era, all the way through Romans and the Christianity. But recently, what we've started looking at is the pre-dynastic era, which is 5500 before the Common Era, and also an era which is called the dawn of Egyptian art, and that's 4400 to 2649 before the Common Era. And these two areas are of extreme interest to me because for the first time what we're seeing is people dissecting and understanding and researching history not from periods of fighting and war or periods of who was ruling when, but actual in terms of cultural similarities, and we're calling these cultural periods. And this was from an exhibit that they had at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year called The Dawn of Egyptian Art that I found so fascinating. So for example, here we have the Badarian period starting in 4400 before the Common Era and going to 3800. Instead of saying, you know, this was the war when the Nubians fought the Egyptians or Kush was fighting the Persians, we have cultural markers. Wheat and barley are farmed, but people were made semi-transient. They herd domesticated animals, and they talk about the different types of cultural similarities that were going on for centuries. And this is really a beautiful way of studying culture and history and cuisine. So be on the lookout for more of this as we go forward. Now, Egyptian cuisine was influenced by about 19 different cultures, and in turn, Egyptian cuisine itself has influenced Lebanese, Sudanese, Arabian, French, Italian, Indian, Spanish, and American cuisine. This over on the left is a picture of the Temple of Karnak in Luxor. How many of you have been to Karnak before? I know Dr. Todros has. Anyone else? Oh, that's great. Okay, so you can see some similarities here. I'll try to use the cursor. Over in this area where you see the reflecting pool, and then you see some of this obelisk over here, there's no mistake or no coincidence that they resemble a lot of what we see on the National Mall. The architectural influences were definitely coming from ancient Egypt at that time. One of the reasons why the ancient Egyptian empire was so important was because of the Nile. The Nile was the highway of ancient Egypt, and this was the era where goods were transported. The Nile was actually worshipped, and there was a god who was sacred named Hapi. He was the god of the Nile. The Nile flooded twice a year, so it provided natural irrigation to give Egypt a lot of sustenance and a lot of crops. And the wealth that the ancient Egyptian empire had was all based on this agriculture because food at the time was exchanged as currency. So unlike the Romans and the Yemenis and many different people in antiquity who had to develop aqueducts, the Egyptians already had, thanks to Mother Nature, this natural system provided to them. And the Nile led into really important trading centers into the Middle East, into Africa, and with Europe. So it was really located at the perfect place to set up this wonderful empire. What we're looking at here are some wooden model boats that were found in tombs in kingdoms. They were important parts of funerary cults. So a lot of people, when they were buried in ancient Egypt, they were buried with things that would make their life better in the afterlife. And by putting these trading ships in the funerary centers, that meant that they would have trade and prosperity and commerce in the afterlife as well. Here are some photos from ancient Egypt, again from on the left Luxor Temple and on the right Karnak. You can see the magnitude that this type of crops and agriculture that was going on in Egypt at the time led to. These were such amazing places in magnitude. What we have in Luxor right now is only about 30 to 40% of what was originally there because a lot of it was destroyed and a lot of it hasn't been discovered yet. But for any of you who have been and seen Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens and Karnak and Luxor Temple, you have just a little bit of an idea of the wealth that was there at that time. This is an example of the ancient Egyptian empire, and we see in modern terms, this is modern day Egypt with all of its ancient names. Then we go up through the Levant and Phoenicia, which is modern day Israel and Lebanon and Syria, and we go up this area all the way into Babylonia. So we can see exactly how wide the ancient Egyptian empire was. Lentils were worth their weight in gold in antiquity. In a lot of Mediterranean cultures, there's a tradition of eating lentils on New Year's because they promote prosperity. And erroneously, a lot of cookbook authors and people who like to talk about food or culture say that this is because the lentils look like coins. But it's not just because they look like coins, it's because they actually were coins in antiquity. So it's hard to think about ingredients that we eat every day and enjoy and take for granted that are really cheap, like lentils and salt and pepper, to think how important they were. You couldn't have a community or an empire if you didn't have these type of things in antiquity. Spices were also very, very important, and spices were very rare. Now, just to give you an idea, this is 3,000 years before the Roman Empire, when in ancient Egypt they're using spices very, very heavily. The Romans were using them more in terms of the emperors and the royalty, but in ancient Egypt at the time they were actually even used by commoners, not in the same amounts, but they were available and accessible. The spices were used in embalming. In 3000 before the Common Era. There was also black pepper that was found in Ramses II's tomb. And why is black pepper significant? Well, the only place it was coming from at the time is what is modern-day China. So that proved that the ancient Egyptians had trade relations with China very, very early on. Hatshepsut, who is the one and only female pharaoh, also coming from Luxor, imported spices from the area of Punt in 1500 before the Common Era. Now, Punt is what is modern day, sometimes referred to as the area of Ethiopia and Yemen and Djibouti, and this type of period. And we know this for sure because if you go to her temple in Luxor, there's a little tree where they have frankincense, and it was saying that this tree came from Punt and that Hatshepsut brought it from there. She was doing an enormous amount of trade. And her actual foreign policy is something that really deserves being studied as well. She was a very effective leader. By 80 before the Common Era in Alexandria, in northern Egypt on the Mediterranean port, this was such an important area that it became the most important trading port on the Mediterranean, and it had an entrance to the city known as Pepper Gate. Crops in antiquity, some of the things that were growing in ancient Egypt were fulmadamus, which is a variety of fava bean. Favas are actually the world's oldest agricultural crop. Date palms were also growing for 5,000 years. Peas, lettuce, beans, cucumbers, and grapes, and a lot of things that we enjoy today were also very, very abundant in ancient Egypt. Because of the abundance and because of the wealth, there was a lot of innovations in cuisine, and we know this because archaeologists actually find remnants of different types of foods and different types of ingredients in the tombs when they do their excavations. We can look back to the first dynasty, which was about 2700 and even before that to 3200 before the Common Era, and we find ancient forms of feta cheese in tombs. And this is very important to do this type of research because in Egypt, unfortunately, the Middle East and Africa, they don't really have laws protecting their culinary products like the European Union does, but feta cheese now can only be called feta if it's done so by the Greek government. But as we see, we have evidence that Egypt had it in 3200 BC. Also, many other countries had it. In the Levant, they had it. In Palestine, they had it. In Bulgaria. So many, many countries had varieties of feta. And then we see tomb scenes like this one here, where bread and different types of pastries were being baked and shaped in mass quantities. This is important because wheat was very scarce in much of the world, but not in North Africa. It was very, very plentiful. So we know that they had a lot of wheat, and we know that they had the sophistication and the technology, not just to make any old loaves, but many, many different types of bread. Bread was so important to the ancient Egyptians that they gave it the same word as life, which is aish. This is different from the Arabic word of khubz. So the Egyptians called bread life. And it's very, very important to this day, and we're going to talk a little bit about modern times later. But in the times when the pyramids were being constructed, the pyramid laborers were rationed 5 pounds of bread per person per day. So that's how much bread there was, and that's how important bread was, and that's how important it is as a staple. Still to this day, if you go to Egypt, you will see people with trays, wooden trays, full of bread, and every single family buys a tray of bread every day, and just the next day they buy a new tray. It's a utensil, it's an important ingredient, and it's just something that you always have on hand. And actually, our origin of the birthday cake and our history and tradition of eating birthday cake dates back to the pharaohs. Because every year on the pharaoh's birthday, they would give him a special little cake with seasoning on it. It was more of a savory type of bread, just to signify his birthday. So in the years later, that fused with our idea of a birthday cake. Now, salt was also very important in antiquity because if you didn't have access to salt, you really couldn't have a very sophisticated society. It was a currency, but also important for a seasoning and important for health reasons. So people had to develop, if they didn't live in an area where they could cultivate their own salt or harvest it, they would have to have good relations with people who could. And the ancient Egyptians set up trading routes with the Phoenicians, who went all around the Mediterranean as early as 2800 before the Common Era to import salt. And a lot of times they imported salted fish. And this is very interesting because people wonder, why salted fish? They had access to fish in other places of the Mediterranean. Well, a lot of different governments, especially the Romans, had very high taxes imposed on salt because they knew how coveted it was and how important it was. And people would usually find a way to pay these taxes, and the Roman government could get richer. So they started imposing these taxes, and people, a lot of them couldn't afford them, but they wanted salt. So what they started doing was salting fish. This was a way of preserving the fish, but it was also a way of transporting salt so that they could get salt without having to pay the high tariffs on it. And these recipes for salted fish became so important that all around the Mediterranean to this day, whether you're in southern Italy or southern Greece, there's specific recipes that use salted fish, anchovies, or sardines in them that wouldn't be the same without them. And even now that there are no taxes, people still prefer to flavor with this type of condiment in modern times. This shows Wadi Natrun, which is a beautiful area in Egypt, very close to the El Fayoum oasis. If you ever go and you're in Cairo, this is about 90 minutes away. You can take a very quick car drive, but it's a world away. You go through a little bit of the desert, and then you get to this beautiful oasis, and there were salt reserves there. And this was where in antiquity they were getting a lot of the salt to export, and they also used the salt in mummification. And this area, you're going to hear more and more about it on the news and in different places because they're doing a lot of excavations, and they're finding a lot of examples of Egyptian Coptic art, monasteries, and early Christian influence in Egypt from this era. Here are some examples of the breads in ancient Egypt. This is from the Agricultural Museum in Cairo, and I apologize for the reflection, but I was lucky enough that they let me take the picture in the museum, so I didn't complain. You can see how similar these breads are to our modern day breads. This one looks a lot like challah. These look like pretzels. This one looks like a bagel or an Italian friselle. You have ones that look like croissant and breadsticks. These are all around in ancient Egypt. And that's one of the things that I think is so beautiful about bread, is that we can make it, and if we're doing it the right way, the traditional way, we're connecting with our ancestors from millennia ago because the process hasn't changed very much. Now, foie gras, many of us know foie gras via the French. It's a very wonderful upscale product that is very important to the culinary patrimony of France, but it also has roots in ancient Egypt. And we know this because if you go to the Egyptian rooms or halls in the Louvre in Paris, you'll see a copy of a Rosetta Stone where they show a picture of the ancient Egyptians. They're hunting with bows and arrows, the geese that are flying above. And all the depictions of the geese have very full stomachs. And what they did was the ancient Egyptians used to follow the migratory patterns of the birds. And they would notice that as soon as the birds took off for flight to migrate, they had gorged themselves beforehand, so they were fatter, and of course, they tasted better. So once they realized that this phenomenon was occurring, they started force-feeding the geese and making foie gras at a very, very early time. And then later on, it became, as we know, an important culinary ingredient around the world. Nourishment was so important to Egyptians that they even took it into the afterlife. Just like we talked about wanting to ensure the success and the prosperity of the afterlife, they also wanted to make sure that they ate really well. So they developed these type of things, which are food mummies. This is actually a roast that's wrapped up and mummified and put into the tomb with the deceased so that they could eat well during the afterlife. And we see many, many examples of this. So that's how important food was to them. It's like, not only does it matter what I eat before I die, but also after I die. And we can't talk about ancient Egypt or the Egyptian culture at all without mentioning the Nubians. Nubians are indigenous to southern Egypt and what is also modern-day northern Sudan. They have their own language and their own culture, and they had 27 different kings who collectively ruled Egypt for a period of about 100 years in antiquity. These are some examples of Nubian foods that are now popular, many of them throughout the world. These are some Nubian spices, which we'll talk more about later. Here we have dried hibiscus leaves. Also dried okra is very common to the Nubian community. Dried dates. This is the juice that comes from the hibiscus leaves, or karkadeh as it's called. And this is some Nubian bread. As people get dispersed around the world, and a lot of people from the Middle East are emigrating, as Nubians emigrate, we find that a lot of them are already having difficulty maintaining Arabic culture and Egyptian culture. So a lot of the Nubian things are being lost. So it's really important that we can pay attention and study and research this, because this is a very rich part of Egyptian culture, and many of the innovations that were taking place in Nubia predated the Arab conquest. We also can mention the Bedouins when we look into any part of the Middle East, but especially ancient Egypt. The Bedouins are really important because they were kind of key holders of the Arab culture as they traveled around, and they were nomadic. They relied on staples like rice and dates and mutton and dairy. And they also kind of set the precursor and the common denominator for culinary etiquette and how you treated people when they were your guests. Because the Bedouins had to travel from place to place and they had to take their livestock with them, they obviously couldn't afford to kill an animal every day and eat meat every single day. So they could only do it when there was a special occasion. What they did do every day was they would milk the animal, and from the milk they would tie a hide between two palm trees and beat it so that they could make butter and cheese. So that would be the daily diet: butter, cheese, yogurt, and a little bit of bread and dates and things that were plentiful at the time. And then when a guest came, they would honor them by having meat and giving one of their animals, because this wasn't just meat for the dinner that day, but it was literally a part of their livelihood. So when you had a guest, to offer them one of your animals meant that you were cutting off part of what you would be able to eat later on in your life. So meat became very, very important. And this is something that, even though it was in antiquity, still permeates every single day in Egypt and in other parts of the Middle East and the Arab world as well. This is in Nuweiba, by the way, which is in Sinai. If you go to Sharm el-Sheikh and on the Red Sea in that area of Egypt, you go a few hours north towards Taba in Israel. Right in the middle, you come to this beautiful, beautiful place called Nuweiba. And these are some Bedouin women who are from there. There's a saying in Arabic that the food equals the affection. And this is also part of the Bedouin culture and the Bedouin tradition, that when you have a guest, you offer as much as possible, because as much as you offer, that shows how much you care for the person. The Jewish community was very prominent and very important in antiquity and also in various parts in Egyptian history. Starting in antiquity, the first synagogue ever was in what is modern-day Aswan. It was actually burnt by the Romans, but it was the first synagogue. And there was also a very important Jewish community in Cairo that in the 12th century had about 80,000 members, and they had in their own area called Harat al-Yahud, which was a square in Cairo. And we can trace, and I have many recipes in the book and holidays that we talk about the different types of things that were eaten for these holidays and how there were collaborations between the Egyptian community and the Jewish community. There were even Jewish pashas at different times. Maimonides was actually the physician to Salahuddin, or Saladin as he is known in English. This is a soup called Jew's mallow, and it comes from a bitter herb that's very similar to arugula. And this was the original bitter herb that was on the Seder plates. It wasn't horseradish. It was this leaf called melocheia, because it grew very plentiful in ancient Egypt. It became one of the most important dishes in the 10th century because because when the caliph from Tunisia, who was coming to take over and claim Cairo, his name was Al-Muizladin Allah. He came from Tunisia, he arrived in Cairo, and he was very sick. So the locals made him this soup, which is usually served with rabbit. In the picture we have chicken, because they do that more nowadays. And he got cured. So he proclaimed it a miraculous soup and a beloved soup, and he named it Melocheia, which comes from the word Maluk, which is the plural word for kings in Arabic. So it went from a very common type of peasant ingredient to a royal soup within a matter of centuries, because it cured this important figure who also named Cairo. He was the person who gave Cairo the name Al-Qahira, or of the victorious. And then we also see that the Jews adapted this idea of carrying nourishment into afterlife, and they fused it in with their own Judaic traditions. So here, I apologize, this is a fuzzy picture, also from the Agriculture Museum. It's a mortuary offering bread from the Jewish community in ancient Egypt. And as we know, Rosh Hashanah is tomorrow, and there are some recipes like challah and Egyptian challah and other things in the book that you can go to. There's actually a full menu. Nile style is divided into cultural culinary menus. So there are menus set from pharaonic Egypt all the way into modern times. We talk about the history of each event, and then we talk about the recipes of them. And this is the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which is in Cairo, which was actually built on top of the place where it was believed that Moses was found in the basket as a baby. So you can go to that and see it's a beautiful place in Old Cairo. Then there was Persian influence in Cairo in the 6th century before the Common Era. And as I mentioned before, when the Persians came in, they set up shop in Luxor, and they destroyed a lot of the temples, and a lot of things were there. But one of the things that they left behind was the sugar crop. And sugar became one of the most important agricultural crops in Egypt from antiquity until nowadays. Now we're talking about 525 BC. So this is very, very early on. In comparison, the French and a lot of people in Europe did not have sugar readily available until the 1600s and the 1700s. And when they had it available, it was sold in the apothecaries, and they would give a teaspoon to people who were lethargic or were sick, or they didn't know exactly how to treat them, so they'd give them a teaspoon of sugar. It was very, very expensive. So here you have the regular everyday Egyptian peasant enjoying sugar in antiquity, but in Europe they're not enjoying it until millennia later. Food was viewed as a medicine prior to 523, before the Common Era. And we have evidence of a lot of ancient Egyptian medical texts. And what we can find from them is that they had developed specific ways of examination, diagnosis, prognoses, simple non-invasive surgeries, and also bone settings in antiquity. And one of the unique things is that 67% of the ancient Egyptian remedies were proved to be true in the 1973 British Pharmaceutical Codex. So people say, you know, okay, well, what about, that was only 67%, what about the other 33? And I say, well, it's not that those were not proven to be not true. Perhaps we just haven't discovered them yet. So we can look to see a lot of medical advances still are being discovered from ancient cultures. There was an Egyptian pharaoh named King Amasis, and he loved the Greeks. He was very, very fond of the Greek culture and the Greek community, which had assimilated quite heavily with the Egyptian community. And in the 6th century before the Common Era, he built them a town on the Nile called Necrautis, and he welcomed them into Egypt. And so many Greeks came into Egypt that the Hellenistic and the Egyptian cultures really, really fused, and it became difficult to know what was Egyptian and what was Greek. And to give you an example of that, in the town called Kom Ombo, further south in Egypt on the Nile, they found a statue, which is the goddess. It's called Aphrodite/Isis, or Isis, as we say in Arabic. So they were actually fusing their religions, fusing the goddesses. They were fusing their styles of dress, fusing the culinary ingredients. So many, many things, when people look at them, we might be influenced and we might know them as Americans as Greek, but they could have very well come from Egypt or vice versa, because there was a lot of exchange going back and forth between these two countries. These are all in modern-day Alexandria. This is the citadel on the Mediterranean with some fishing boats, and this is the port of the Mediterranean, and this is the Alexandria Library, which is built on the same place that the ancient library was built. Then we have the founding of Alexandria in 332 before the Common Era by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great never actually set foot on the soil of Alexandria, but he founded it from afar on the island of Pharos. And so again, the Greek influence grew and continued to stay strong in Alexandria. This dish on the right is what we know as moussaka, which is a Greek eggplant dish that has layered with eggplant and bechamel sauce and meat and things like that and tomatoes. And a lot of times in the Mediterranean, there's this kind of fight of who had moussaka first, because in the Arab world, moussaka is known as msa'a, and it was made with eggplant and meat and pomegranate molasses and other things long before the tomatoes and things like that came from the New World. And also, it was the Arabs who introduced the eggplant to Europe. So probably the origins of the dish are definitely Arabic and Central Asian, but over the years it got introduced. It became a very important part of the Greek culture and of other cultures as well. Here we have a photo of the Silk Road, which goes back to 206 before the Common Era. And we can see the main Silk Road, which is this golden area here. And then we see some connectors, which is down through Egypt. And we see the sea route, which is through Egypt. So once again, even despite those ancient Egyptian trade routes, which were very, very large, we also have now new trade routes coming in with the Silk Route, so making Egypt more and more important. Then we have the Roman occupation in the 1st century. Now, the Romans came to Egypt not like the Greeks to assimilate and to learn and to really fuse, but to occupy. They wanted the wheat and they wanted the grain, and they wanted access to the trade routes, because with the wheat and the grain, they could supply sustenance and wealth to the entire Roman Empire, which at the time spanned all the way what is to modern day Great Britain. So it was very, very wide. We have examples of the Egyptian recipes in Rome, thanks to this gentleman down here, who was a Roman philosopher named Apicius. Has anybody heard of him before? He's very, very important, and he's known to be the father of all gourmands. And the reason for this is because he was a poor writer, but he loved food so much that he actually he had the palate of an emperor, and he went bankrupt because he couldn't afford to eat as well as he liked, so he actually committed suicide. So we say that he did the ultimate sacrifice for food, which was he killed himself. But he wrote the first Western cookbook called De Re Culinaria in Latin, or On Cooking in English. It's translated into many languages. You can get it and read it. And in this wonderful cookbook, we can see how people ate all around North Africa, not only in Egypt or in Rome, and what kind of the styles of the days were, what spices they had access to. One of the things that Apicius mentioned is the bread from Alexandria. He was really in love with the bread from Alexandria, and he mentions these prawns or shrimp, which the Roman emperors used to send fleets to the coast of North Africa to bring them back. And still today in Italy, there's a lot of studying of marine biology and the way that the fish are migrating and that the seafood is migrating, and people pay close attention to get the best fish at the best time. This was actually something that started with the Romans. The Romans and the Greeks also coveted Egyptian wine, which is really fascinating, not just the fact that Egyptians had great wine, but the fact that it was being grown in what is now the Western Desert. So 5,000 years ago, this area that is completely desert now was very, very lush and very fertile, so much so that the Greeks and Romans preferred its wine to their own wine. We know a lot about ancient Egypt and what was going on in that type of Greco-Roman era because of Cleopatra. During her relationship with Mark Antony, she led such a fragrant lifestyle that they called themselves the inimitable livers, and they wanted to really set the standard of what high living was. She had her palace tables decked out in gold and silver. She used a lot of tortoiseshell and glassware, and she had pools that were kept full of fresh lotus flowers. And of course, many of you have seen lotus before. You know that they're very beautiful. But this was also very symbolic because as you think of where Cleopatra was geographically, she was in northern Egypt. And the lotus was the symbol of power and the flag and the emblem of ancient Egypt. So by having pools full of this flower, it reminded everybody around that she didn't just rule northern Egypt, but also southern Egypt, and exactly how the extent of her power and her role as connecting these two parts of the nation. Her dinners would consist of things like oysters and wild boar, roasted fish, peacocks, flamingos, seafood, and quails. She also had a lot of pastries, which probably, as you would imagine, had figs and dates and honey, nuts, and berries, and things like that. But she was also known to use sugar quite extensively. And in Nile style, I also have a recipe that was translated from hieroglyphs, which are called Cleopatra's Kisses. And what they are they're a half walnut that are filled with a sugar marzipan. And she was said to have fed these to Mark Antony. So if you look at that recipe and you create it at home, you can reenact that whole scene in the privacy of your own home. Walnuts were believed to be very important for mental power and intelligence in antiquity. And it sounds kind of like, you know, a wives' tale. But it's been proven that the fatty acid in walnuts are really good for brain power nowadays too. So there was some truth to that. Now, architecture was also an area of study at the time. And the Romans really wanted to emulate a lot of what they were seeing in ancient Egypt. So you see the temple of Edfu, which is on the left, which was the temple of Horus in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And then on the right, you see a 1st century villa in Italy. And this is in the town of Pozzuoli. And you can see the similarities between Edfu and this villa, which was one of the emperor's villas. Now, has anybody ever heard of Pozzuoli before in Italy? Pozzuoli is where Sophia Loren is from. So we can see 1st century before the Common Era, the Romans, and the type of things that they were borrowing from the Egyptians. Now, the Romans also introduced Christianity into Egypt, and this was very important because this was the 1st century before the Common Era, but then in the 4th century, the churches split, and they were divided between East and West. When they were divided, Egypt became Egyptian Orthodox or Coptic Christians, which followed a slightly different calendar from the Roman Catholics. And part of the religion was to fast, and there were a certain amount of fast days on the calendar, and fast doesn't mean not eating at all. What it meant was being a vegan. So no meat, no fish, no dairy during this time of the year. And there were usually about 55 days in Lent. Then there were other days before Christmas for different feasts of different saints or the Virgin Mary, where the Coptic community still to this day hold these type of fasts where they're vegans. Now, I mentioned to you before the Bedouins and the importance of meat and how much Egyptians love meat and why this is an important part of the culture. So imagine you come from this meat-loving culture and all of a sudden you join a religion which pretty much a third of your year tells you have to be a vegan. It's really, really hard, and it's a big sacrifice. So what the Egyptians did and what the Syrians did and the Armenians and Greeks and a lot of people who are Ethiopians, part of that Eastern Orthodox religion, was they developed really wonderful fasting recipes that are vegan recipes. So if any of you are vegan, I really recommend that you look towards these communities because you're going to find the most flavorful recipes out there. They're not like recipes that are just using substitutes for meat. There are recipes that really can stand up to meat and taste great. And one of them is over here. This is tamea, or the Egyptian fava falafel. Many of you know falafel in the Levant or in other areas of the Middle East are made with chickpeas, but in Egypt they make them with dried split favas. They're absolutely wonderful. They have lots of spice in them and herbs, and this was one of the things that the Egyptian Coptic community developed as a replacement for meat, and they're available everywhere and very delicious. There's a recipe in Nile style. Here we have some vegetable kebabs, and here we have a dish called fatir, which a lot of people believe that fatir was the original pizza, but it's kind of an injustice to call it pizza because it's very rich. It's almost like a homemade puff pastry that you make and layer with layers of clarified butter one after the other and then bake. And if any of you are interested in this recipe, on my YouTube channel, which you have access to on the program note, there's actually a series called Delicious Destinations Luxor, where I went to Luxor and worked with a chef and we reenacted the original ancient fatir recipe. So you can watch that. Then Islam came in the 7th century, and Islam was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca, and then the 4 rightly guided caliphs dispersed the religion into the rest of the Arab world and the Middle East. The caliphates are very, very important because as we study history and as we study culture and cuisine, many people say, this is Syrian, this is Lebanese, this is Egyptian, but really it isn't. It might be Umayyad, it might be Abbasid, it might be Fatimid. So as we learn these caliphates, we can more accurately identify which time period and which place things came from because we didn't have the same nationalistic borders back then that we do now. So the Umayyads were from 661 to 750, Abbasids were from 750 to 1258, then we have the Spanish Umayyads, which kind of overlapped the two, 756 to 1031, the Aghlabids from 800 to 909, Fatimids from 909 to 1171, and the Ayyubids from 1169 to 1260. Now, the Umayyads were very, very important. They were based in Syria, but this was the caliphate which really promoted city dwelling. So we don't think about that nowadays. We think about these great, cities in the Middle East like Cairo and like Damascus, and we think that they were always there, but they weren't. The Umayyads had a big role in developing cosmopolitanism and making cities important trade centers. They introduced Islamic art and architecture and also palatial cuisine. Here are some Umayyad influences in Cairo. We see some spices on the left, and then we see the Khana Khalili spice market. Now, Khana Khalili Bazaar was not built until the 14th century, but it was built because of the trade that started being promoted by the Umayyads 7 centuries earlier. The spices, as I mentioned, really, really did build an empire. And just like the agricultural crops gave the wealth in antiquity, by this time period, it was the spices and the fact that the Umayyads controlled the spice trade, which made this empire so wealthy. And here we can see the spice routes, and you see Egypt right here, and you see pretty much all of them going right through or at some point leading to Egypt. And the most close one, this is very, very important, is here, down here in Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a little island which is about 15 miles off the coast of Tanzania. It's my dream to go there and to film there because it's a spice island. And you can see where the cloves were harvested, where many of these original recipes came from. So this is Zanzibar, and you see everything else traveling from China and the spice islands over here in the Far East. Now, the Abbasids came in 750 to 1258. This caliphate was known to create what we call the golden era of Islamic civilization. They had a lot of wealth and a lot of power. They guaranteed free education to all of the classes, even the military, which was unheard of at that time. They had free public schools. They had a lot of wonderful kind of public services, and it really created this wonderful community. And we see that the expansion here, based in Baghdad, this map is in Arabic, so a lot of the names, like Masr, that's the Arabic name for Egypt, Afrikaya, which was the area that is modern-day Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Maghreb, which is Morocco, and Al-Andalus, which is, of course, Andalusia or southern Spain. Baghdad was the center of empirical life, and the Baghdadis took their cuisine and a lot of their influence from the Persians, which were located, of course, very close. So we see a lot of kind of sweet and sour things and a lot of cooking applications and a lot of palatial court cuisine that the Persians had already used being adapted into Baghdad. And there are still 13 medieval Arabic cookbooks from this caliphate that are available that we can look at today in the world. And many of them are available here at the Library of Congress. Then we can't talk about the cuisine of Egypt or its expansion into the world without talking about Abdul Rahman, who was a Muslim prince in southern Spain. And he was the first in a line of his successors who also bore his name. But he was very important because he was exiled from Syria over into southern Spain. And he all of a sudden had to populate southern Spain, and he had to make it rival the court cuisine that was going on in Baghdad, because Baghdad was kind of like modern-day Dubai, and Spain was like the Wild West. They had nothing. So he wanted to do everything in his power to make it stand up to Baghdad. So what he did was he hired this gentleman, who was a sort of court servant from the courts of Baghdad. His name was Abu Hassan, but he was known by the name Ziryab, which meant blackbird. And that's because his voice had a very beautiful sound to it, so like a blackbird, so they called him Ziryab. He was very, very important in all types of the daily living arts: music, cuisine, fashion, art, architecture, gardening, and botany. He knew a lot about pretty much everything that there was to know. And what he did was he imported rice, spices, okra, and hibiscus from Egypt all the way into southern Spain. So he left Baghdad, he traveled through North Africa, picked up these ingredients from Egypt, and then brought them to southern Spain and introduced them to the court. And what happened over the years was the the Egyptian rice, which is sometimes in English called Kelrose rice. You can get it at Whole Foods, or you can get it at the Middle Eastern stores where they call it Egyptian rice. This is like the grandfather or the predecessor to the bomba rice that they have in Spain, or the calasparra rice, and then later the arborio and the rices that they have in Italy. Very starchy short grain rice. It was planted in Spain, it did very well, as did the saffron. And what happens, all of a sudden, we have recipes like paella, which are based upon rice and saffron and things like this. This were originally introduced from Ziryab. He also introduced many, many songs, and this instrument, which is in English called the lute, or the oud in Arabic, and he opened the first flamenco school in southern Spain. He was also the person who said that men should have short hair and that we shouldn't wear white in winter. So many, many of our gardening ideas, of our fashion ideas, about the way of decor, we might think they're Victorian or coming from France or different places in Europe, but they're actually coming from Baghdad via Egypt and Muslim Spain in the 10th century, thanks to this gentleman. And there's a restaurant named for him in Paris called Ziryab. So here we see kabsa. This is a dish in Saudi Arabia, which is a rice type of a skillet that has chicken, and then it has some pine nuts or almonds and some raisins on top. I have that recipe in my Arabian Delights book. Then we see, very similarly, the arroz and paella all of a sudden appear in southern Spain with these ingredients that Ziryab introduced. And then risotto alla milanese, which also has a very similar, the derivative of the rice and the saffron that was brought thanks to Ziryab. The Fatimids were the next groups, which are very, very important, not only in Egypt, but in all of the Mediterranean. This was a North African Shiite dynasty that was based in Tunisia. And you can see this area here with all of this little checkerboard. That was their territory. And look right up here to Sicily, which is very key because the Fatimids claimed Sicily as their capital, Palermo, 50 years before they claimed Cairo. So that's how important Sicily was to them, and that's just how deep the Sicilians are rooted in Arab culture, that it shows this. Now, I love talking about the Fatimids because the Fatimids love to celebrate. And what they did in order to celebrate was whatever holiday it was, no matter whose religion it was, whether it was Jewish tradition or Christian or Islamic, was they would invite all the people, all the citizens of the society out into the street. They would set up lights all along the Nile or whatever Mediterranean body of water they had, and they would encourage everybody to celebrate. And one of the ways that they got them to celebrate was they reclaimed recipes from ancient times, especially sweet recipes, and introduced them to everybody. And these became known as Fatimid sweets, or as sweets that were typical of that particular holiday. So that nowadays, when you go to Sicily or when you go to Cairo, you may find that the same sweet is being eaten for different holidays. On the Mulad al-Nabi, or the Prophet Muhammad's birthday in Cairo, they eat the same type of torrone or nougat that they eat for the feast of the Santa Rosalia in Sicily. And that's because of the Fatimid influence. And if it wasn't for the Fatimids, we probably wouldn't have these recipes anymore at all, because the early Christians and the early Muslims found that a lot of these traditions that predated the religions were paganistic, so they outlawed them. So by the Fatimids allowing a lot of these traditions again and allowing the recipes, people were able to enjoy them and the recipes lived. So here we see a little mention about the Mulids. Mulid is the name of it's a birth celebration that they have in Egypt, and they have them for specific religious figures that were revered. They could be Jewish figures. They have one for Abu al-Hasira in the town of Damanhur in the north, or they could be Christian. A lot of times they have them for the Virgin Mary, or the Muslims have them for the Prophet Muhammad or for other sheikhs. And here we see again some of the hazelnut nougat that would be one of the recipes. And this on the right is the Mosque of Al-Azhar, which is ironic because later Al-Azhar became known as the seat of Sunni Islam. So this was a Shiite group. And they named the mosque, they constructed it, and they named it Al-Azhar after the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, whose name was Fatima al-Azhara. So, and it's just ironic that later on it became the seat of Sunni Islam. So here we have another cookie called kak. Now these kak are ancient Egyptian cookies, which were falling out of fashion and again not being served during early Christian times and early Muslim times, that the Fatimids brought back and used them, and not just did they make them again, but they actually incorporated them as part of the Eid al-Fitr, which is the 3-day holiday after Ramadan. As Ramadan ends and people end their fasting and they go into the holiday period, one of the religious requirements is that they give something called zakat al-fitr, or a charity, because your fasting is not accepted unless you give charity. Once you give the charity, you're done, you can celebrate and go on and forward with your life. So what the Fatimids did was they took these ancient cookies and they stuffed them with gold coins and they distributed them to the poor. So now you have this cookie, which is all of a sudden reappearing on the scene that had been forgotten about for years, ancient, and you're giving it as a charity to poor people filled with coins. So you're fulfilling your religious duty, you're making a recipe which was from ancient times and making everybody happy. So the kak are still a really important part of Egyptian history and recipes, and Christians eat them at Christmas and Muslims eat them for the Eid al-Fitr. And of course they're not stuffed with gold coins, of course, anymore, but they are stuffed with a mixture called agameya, which is made with honey and it's gold, it's to replicate the coins, or with Turkish delight, which came later, or they're just served plain. Now in the 12th century were the Ayyubids, and many of you know this caliphate from Saladin, who was their most famous member, or Salahuddin as he's known in Arabic. But during the 12th century, during this era of the citadel, they were producing more than 12,000 tons of food per day. And Saladin's grandnephew actually wrote a cookbook, which is entitled A Way to Express the Love of All Good Things. And he had a recipe in this cookbook for veal scallopini, Egyptian style, which were scallopini, which were cut very, very thin, but they were not pounded, they were just smoked. And so this was a unique recipe that we can look back to the 13th century and trace to this time period. Cairo was so wealthy at this time that this is a quote that I found from a rabbi, which really, really tells the story. If we can't be there, we can't experience it, we see what goes on in modern days, this is a good way of understanding what was happening in the 15th century. We arrived in Cairo on Sunday, June 17th, 1481. If I were able to write about its wealth and its people, all of this book would not be sufficient. I swear that if I were able to put Rome, Venice, Milan, Padua, Florence, and 4 more cities together, they would not equal in wealth and in population half that of Cairo. So we can imagine what it must have been like for someone to come from Italy and say this in the 15th century, and to have 12,000 tons of food being prepared in one establishment. They had free hospitals for the needy, and they would invite the needy there to get cured, of course, for free, and they would not release them from the hospital unless they could eat an entire chicken in one sitting. So that's the kind of medical care that they had at that time. So then the Ottomans came onto the scene, and they took over, again, because of the trade routes and because of the wealth and the central location of Egypt. And they introduced a lot of recipes into Egypt that were unique. We know the recipes that are specifically Ottoman because during the Ottoman Empire, in the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, they actually would employ 1,000 chefs at a time. And each of those 1,000 chefs had 100 understudies. And each of those 1,000 chefs and their 100 understudies only made one dish for their whole entire career. So if I was working in that time period, I might only make this dish, which is called Charkazeya, or Circassian chicken. That way, when I die, the recipe lives, and when that person dies, the recipe lives, and it's documented so nobody can change or alter the recipe. That's how we know it's Ottoman. So when the Turks say this is an Ottoman recipe, they pretty much have proof that it is. And this recipe became very important to Egyptians, although Egyptians eat it a little bit differently than the Turks do. And this is Turkish delight, which is called melban in Egypt, and also became very, very important. Then we have the art of stuffing vegetables. This is stuffed cabbage, but little stuffed baby. Who said yes? You? Someone really loves stuffed vegetables. Me too, they're my favorite. You have a little baby eggplant, little baby zucchini, peppers, tomatoes, all kinds of things are stuffed in Egypt, depending upon the season, and they're really delicious. They're one of the highlights of the Egyptian diet. And the Turks struck special deals with the Spaniards. So when ingredients were coming from the New World, a lot of people don't realize, because everywhere in the world now we love peppers, and we love tomatoes, and we love potatoes, and we love corn, and we love chocolate. Those were all New World ingredients that people did not have in the Middle East or in any part of the world other than the Americas before the 16th century. But because the Turks struck these special deals, they got access to these ingredients a little bit before Europe. And the way that they entered the Middle East was very, very different because, for example, when potatoes made their way to France, they were served to prisoners and they were really, viewed with distrust. In order to get people to eat them, Marie Antoinette had to make a campaign showing that potatoes were fashionable and that she ate them, so then everybody else ate them. But because the Turks knew that they would be great ingredients and introduced them, and everybody in the Ottoman territories wanted to emulate the Turks, they were accepted right away, and they started using them in culinary ingredients right away. This is another example of Turkish influence in Egyptian culture, and that's the tanura. This is this skirt that Egyptian dancers wear, folkloric dancers, that looks when they spin around, it looks like a top. It's very, very colorful. And this is a folkloric, colorful spin on the whirling dervishes in Turkey that has lost its religious significance, but is still very, very important in terms of culture and in folklore in Egypt. In 16th century, coffee arrived in Egypt, and at this time, we don't have time to go into the entire history of coffee today, unfortunately, but as we look at it, we know that it comes from originally modern-day Ethiopia, then goes into Yemen, and then to Mecca, and then to Egypt. In each of those places that it went through, it was passed from hand to hand of Sufis. These were religious clerics who only used the coffee to keep them awake during religious ceremonies, which are called zikr. During these ceremonies, they invoke the name of God many, many times. It's kind of like a chant. And they do this. They would drink the coffee to stay awake. Now, because this was going on in Cairo, and the Turks were in power in Cairo, they said, wait a minute, this drink doesn't have anything to do with religion. We can have the drink, and we can introduce it to everybody. And all of a sudden, coffee houses started springing up. So there were 650 coffee houses in Cairo alone before Europe ever even knew about coffee. The Turks took the coffee and said, we're going to introduce it to Europe as the wine of the Arabs, because just like the wine is viewed as a sacrament in the church, the coffee was being used in the mosques. So they did that. They introduced it as the wine of the Arabs, and it caught on, and coffee became popular ever since. Now, Egyptian goods as a whole were coveted in Europe, not just the coffee, and they were very, very important. Egyptian rugs, any type of even Turkish or Ottoman product, anything that looked like it had a Turkish or an Arabic script on it sold very, very well on the European markets, so much so that there were counterfeiters that would just make kind of scribbles, and for people who didn't know the difference or couldn't read Arabic would buy them, paying more money, thinking that they came from the Middle East. But this is a statue in Rome, in the Piazza della Minerva, which is by the church Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Minerva is the name of the Roman goddess who was actually Isis. As I mentioned, Aphrodite, Isis, they would fuse their gods and goddesses. Well, they fused also in Rome, so they had the same goddess, but they called her Minerva. And the reason why this church is called sopra Minerva is because it was on top of Minerva. So you have this all over Europe, but especially in Rome, many Christian churches built on top of what were once Egyptian temples. So this was one of those places. And Bernini, the sculptor Bernini in the 17th century, made this statue with an Egyptian obelisk on it. And on the bottom, he put an elephant. And people asked him, why did you put the elephant on the obelisk? And he said, because it would take an elephant to support the weight of the Egyptian knowledge. So someone even as important and as impressive as Bernini was really looking towards the Egyptians. In 1798, Napoleon invaded. He was only there for 3 years, and of course, a lot of lives were lost. But it was very important because Napoleon started a lot of trends which are still popular now today in Egypt. This is his favorite dish called fatta, which is a lamb dish with very different from the fatta in the Levant, which is made with yogurt. But this has some leftover bread and toasted bread and Egyptian rice and a spicy tomato garlic sauce. It's a wonderful recipe, and they say that this was his favorite when he was there. Napoleon is believed to be the father of all Egyptologists because what he did was he hired scores of scribes to come with him and to record everything they saw, from the ancient history to the botany to the temperature to the animals and what was going on in the cuisine. And he recorded them all into 21 different volumes that he called the Description de l'Égypte. And then he sold these in Paris, and you can see they have his commission. And up until very recently, these were on view at the Dehesh Museum, which is in New York City. So people could actually go and see these. And it was really, really very, very amazing to be able to see that he had this impressive thing on his with his name on it. So now it has 1 volume, and we believe that because he studied ancient Egyptian history, he's the father of Egyptologists, because nobody had done this before him. Then came Muhammad Ali in the 19th century. He was an Albanian leader in the Ottoman army, that he became the ruler of Egypt and the father, we believe, of modern Egypt, because he introduced the rail systems, free public education, and a lot of wonderful things. This is his namesake mosque in Cairo, where his mausoleum is, but you can see it actually looks very much like the Turkish mosques, because he was introducing a lot of Turkish elements as well. My favorite thing that he did was to introduce the mangoes from India, because Egyptian mangoes really, really are superior. I've become a mango snob thanks to my time in Egypt, and I will not eat mangoes anywhere else. They're really wonderful, and they came from from India, and they did very, very well on the Egyptian soil. The other thing that came from India is kushari, which I like to call kushari Cairo in a cup, because it has layers of rice, a spicy tomato sauce, chickpeas, lentils, fried onions on top. So it has elements and ingredients from pretty much every single place in history, and it's very, very common, and it's a street food, so you can get it anywhere, and it's very tasty. It evokes Cairo to me. Then in 1869, with the invention of the Suez Canal, it was very, very easy to get more trading into Egypt, and so tea became something that was introduced more and more. And tea quickly surpassed coffee and became pretty much the national drink of Egypt. In 20th century, we see a lot of European-style cafes being opened up. And in 1922, when Carter discovered King Tut's tomb, as I mentioned, because Napoleon was bringing a lot of Europeans in and kind of talking about Egyptology and this kind of thing, and now you have people excavating and finding things, you all of a sudden have this foreign community, this expat community in Egypt that needs places to eat. And restaurants were not part of the local Egyptian community, so the only way that you could really eat would be either to have someone bring you food, or would be to go into someone's home. And that culturally, that might have not always been appropriate, especially in a lot of the rural areas in southern Egypt where they were doing the excavations. So now there is a need for restaurants. So you see kind of home-style dining in southern rural Egypt, where people are sitting, they still do this today, spreading tables, cloths on the floor and sitting down and eating this way. And then you see hotel and this type of like foreign restaurant dining. There was no Arabic model for restaurants, so they had to go to the West and bring that in and incorporate that into Egypt. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot of times there are more local restaurants that are incorporating a lot of the different folkloric elements. This is a restaurant right on the Nile, which I used to consult for. And when they started, they had a completely Western menu. It was like roast beef, grilled chicken breast, things like that. And it was specifically to cater to foreigners. And then little by little, we were able to incorporate an Egyptian menu and to translate that for things that tourists would like. And this is a picture from making the fatir that I mentioned earlier in that video. So this is actually how it's made. You can go onto YouTube and check that out. In conclusion, here are a few modern dishes, again, with ancient Egyptian roots. We see the paella, the risotto alla milanese, biscotti, and birthday cake. And I'd just like to say a little bit about agriculture in Egypt. This is a quote that was said by an economist from Egypt's Agricultural Economics Research Institute. And he said, "A country's agricultural sector is a vital characteristic of its strength, and that it symbolizes a nation's ability to sustain life." And we can look here and see where agriculture was in 2010, 20% of the Egyptian economy. Now, we talked about antiquity when it was pretty much 100% of the Egyptian economy, and we know how well they did then. Then we see the projected sector of 7.1 by 2030. So this is really an area of focus, and something that economists and people in the tourism industry and in the food industry and in the agricultural industry and politics really need to take into consideration as we move forward in Egypt, because as we can see, agriculture is really synonymous with success. And I was able to spend a lot of time in Egypt during the revolution and after the revolution. And I can see kind of this impact. And seeing all of these different wonderful examples of the agriculture that it has to offer and the systems that it has, I think it's very important that we preserve them as a whole, as well as the recipes and the cultural traditions in order to move Egyptian cuisine and culture forward. Thank you all very much for coming. And I'd love to take questions, comments.
Does Sharia law have anything to say about diet and or cooking?
Oh, yes, great question. The question is, does Sharia law or Islamic law have anything to say about diet or cooking? We could do an entire semester on that topic, and I've covered some of it in Arabian Delights and some of it in Nile Style, especially for newcomers. And there's another lecture that I did here 2 years ago called Cuisine and Culture of the Arab World, where I touched a little bit more heavily on that. Very, very important. This is the main way of understanding it, the way that I look in very simple terms. Prior to the 7th century, there were a lot of natural ingredients and a lot of traditional medicinals that were being used. When Islam came into place, they kind of highlighted them because there were a lot of what is called hadith, or sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that were revealed specifically to talk about ingredients like honey. There's another ingredient called habat al-baraka, which that means the blessed seed in Arabic, but in English we call it nigella seed or the black seed. Sometimes they call it black cumin, but that's not correct. So this seed, the Prophet Muhammad said, eat of this seed because in it there's a cure for everything except death. So to this day, you can go to a Middle Eastern supermarket and you'll find tonics made out of habat al-baraka, cough syrup, things like that. They do many things with it. And I was talking about this once at the University of Alexandria in Egypt, giving a lecture, and a doctor from Al-Azhar came up to me after. He said, Amy, please don't mention the habat al-baraka again. And I said, why? He said, because there are 21 different varieties. We don't know which one the Prophet was talking about, and people in the world are going to laugh at us if they don't get cured from illnesses, so just don't mention that to anybody. So that's one little example of one ingredient. But there are also examples like you should never lay down after you're eating, you should always sit while you're eating, you always eat with your right hand, you always wash your hands before you eat. So it's much more than just ingredients or health. It's spiritual satisfaction. It's the way you're grateful for food, and really, really beautiful traditions. There's, I believe, a book called I might get the name wrong, but it's similar to Natural Medicines of the Prophet that tells many of them, and you can get them online. There's an Islamic bookstore in Baltimore that's online, and you can find volumes written on this topic. It's very fascinating, and many of them have been proven to be true. Wonderful question. Yes?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, madam. I was moved to say Tislam Adeki.
Allah
I
khair, shukran.
hear a lot, actually, when someone cooks something and
Uh-huh.
they say something like Tislam Adeki,
Uh-huh.
thank your hands.
Right.
Have you ever run across that phrase, or do you know where it comes
Of
from?
course, yeah. So the question is the phrase Tislam Adiki, or bless your hands. Whenever someone offers you something in Egypt, the usual response is to say, bless your hands. And even today when we were getting started, Dr. Muhammad gave me a glass of water, and I said to him, Tislam Adiki, because it's just something nice. If someone offers you something, you should bless their hands. And it's such a beautiful tradition. Once you get used to it, even if you can't say it because it doesn't make sense in a different culture, usually I think it because it's very, very beautiful. And this is born out of that culture because in a lot of ancient cultures, they appreciated food more than we do nowadays. So because food was part of hospitality, because food was part of culture, I would guess that this dated back to the Bedouins. Yes, wonderful comment. Any other questions? Yes? Oh, great question. I love to talk about that. What are the most common types of oils in Egypt? This is a big misnomer, and people just have no clue. So that's why I love to talk about it. Oils in terms of fats, there are many. The first one and the most important kind of historically would be what we call samna, or aged clarified butter, which in Indian and in America we know it as ghee. This is a very, very important fat. What they do is they take butter, they skim the fat off the top, they clarify it, then they pour it through cheesecloth, which removes all of the fat impurities and just leaves that pure, solid yellow butter. And then they age it. They close it in a jar, they leave it for like a month. This has a really deep flavor, so when you cook onions or meat or spices, it's very, very fragrant. And that would be a traditional thing that people would use, and many women, even today, housewives make it at home. Other than that, olive oil, because they have wonderful olives in Egypt, especially the Siwa Oasis. They do not get the world recognition that they deserve, but Egyptian olive oil, if you can get it, is very, very wonderful. That's one. Unfortunately, because of distribution ways, it's more common in Egypt to get an oil from another country than it is to get the one that comes right from Egypt. But hopefully that will be changing. On your list there, you have some different ways to stay in touch. On Facebook, I have a group called Nile-Style Egyptian Cuisine and Culture. And 3 days ago, I talked about a chef colleague of mine who's the head of the Luxor Chef Association, who's working on preserving the Egyptian olive oils. Having said that, the most common oil nowadays, unfortunately, is corn oil. And that's because it's cheap. There's a lot of corn being grown, and we see corn oil being used instead of samna and instead of, or ghee, or instead of olive oil in many places. And in Nile style, every time I mention corn oil, I say expeller pressed corn oil. People always ask me why. Well, in this country, when you get corn oil, if it's not expeller pressed, they used heat methods. And when they use those heating methods, one of the chemicals that's involved in that is hexane, which is actually a dry cleaner chemical. So the only way you can avoid that is if you get an expeller pressed vegetable oil, corn oil, whatever, and that's what I recommend. It's good because it doesn't have flavor and it won't impart a different flavor on your dish. But if you want a real Egyptian dish, for cold dishes, I would say use olive oil. For hot dishes, I would say use the samna or the ghee. And they have different kinds of ghee. You can get the ghee with buffalo milk. You can get it with cow milk. You could get a vegan ghee. I like the buffalo milk. And if you think about it, actually, the Italians got the buffalo in antiquity, like that they make the buffalo mozzarella with, from Egypt. Just how that mozzarella de buffalo has that wonderful, rich flavor, more than the milk from the cow, so does the ghee. But if you can't find it, the regular cow one is good too. It's a great question. Thank you. Anyone else? No? Well, thank you all for your patience and for listening to me. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.